Hey DDI, I'm Sean Kennedy. I'm a recent PhD from the University of Kansas in communication studies. I've been an assistant debate coach there for the last 7 or so years. And I'm going to be doing some topic lectures and electives and lab Q&A sessions at the DDI. I'm sort of like a designated lecturer that's going to be talking about some various kind of background issues on the topic. So I'm going to be doing two kind of longer lectures, both of which are intended to provide you some context and background for the upcoming debate topic. So the first of those is From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, which is what this lecture is the first part of. And the second of those is Political Economy of Prisons and Policing. So the first lecture, From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, is going to be a little bit more of the historical context. And then Political Economy of Policing and Prisons is going to talk about some of the underlying economic structures and ideological concepts that underlie the criminal legal system in the United States. So keep in mind, as I'm doing this this lecture, sorry, that the history that I'm presenting here is contested. You know, you'll read a lot of different evidence and accounts in various places that disagree with some of what I'm trying to say. And what you should take is that my goal is not to give you the end-all be-all account of, you know, the history from slavery to mass incarceration. It's a huge history. My discipline is communication studies, not history. So I'm not an expert in this area. But my intention with this lecture is to just give you a baseline for further research. You have some ideas about some of the significant events and timelines that various historians and social theorists talk about and debate about. And with that baseline in mind, hopefully you can go forward and do research and develop your own sort of perspective on some of these historical events. So some of the major sources I've used for this lecture include the documentary 13th, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and Louis Quequant's From Slavery to Mass Incarceration article from the New Left Review. And I tried to supplement those sources with additional research in other places as needed, because there's some really important things that aren't included in those accounts. But if you're looking to kind of follow up or to find more about some of the stuff that I'm discussing in this lecture, all of those sources are good places to go to. So there's 4 goals for this lecture for you all. Things that you should be taking out of it and reasons why this lecture can be useful to you. First is that the lecture provides historical context for reading evidence. So when you're reading cards that talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, when you're thinking about, you know, the Southern strategy, when you're looking to see, you know, what does mass incarceration in the 1980s and 1990s look like? What are some of the pieces of legislation, like the various crime bills that shaped it? This lecture will hopefully at least give you an introductory set of tools to understand and read the evidence that either you might find when you're researching an affirmative or negative, or that you might debate in around the season. Number 2 is this lecture should give you some research search terms. After the lecture, hopefully you'll have a basic conceptual model that helps you generate new search terms, and that allows you, again, to filter through sources and to get a sense of what those various sources are saying, and to figure out what matters and what doesn't. Third, the intention for this lecture is to serve as a source for examples. So in debates, especially, you know, AF versus neg, debates about Afro-pessimism or prison abolition or the neoliberalism critique, there's going to be a lot of back and forth example using by both sides. And part of the intention of this lecture is to sort of give you tools going into those debates to develop better and more on-point examples to sort of beat back the other team. And then finally, fourth is that historical context and history serve as engines for what people in communication studies call rhetorical invention. In other words, if you're sitting there in a debate and you're thinking to yourself, you know, how do I think of a new argument to beat this set of evidence that I've never heard before, or this line of argument that I've never thought about before, understanding history will really improve your rebuttals. It will give you sort of raw source material to generate new arguments that your opponent maybe hasn't thought about, or that will allow you to make second and third level refutations of your opponent's evidence as you progress into rebuttal. So the intention of this lecture is it gives you some raw background knowledge that you can use to generate new arguments that your opponent may not have thought about. So as we're kind of going into the lecture, there's 4 big picture elements that I want you to take away about the structure of the racial caste system in the United States. First, essentially throughout US history, and even in the colonial Americas prior to the founding of the United States, there has been a continuous white over black color line that has maintained itself as a sort of permanent racial hierarchy. Now, that's not to say that that's the only relevant racial hierarchy, or that there are not other forms of oppression that have existed in the United States, or have, other forms of social division that have been salient. It's that white over black color line has been a relatively constant background condition to all of those other forms of social division. So racial caste in the US is complex, but regardless of its various mutations across time, white over black hierarchy has remained an ongoing feature of the American racial caste system and US society. Number 2, at the same time, that racial caste system has been unstable. So while the white over black color line has been continuous, there have been numerous points where the US racial caste system has been prone to disruption in some pretty fundamental ways. Some of those include things like the Civil War, the radical populist movements of the 1880s and 1890s, the labor mobilizations of the 1940s through the 1960s, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter and defund the police movements today. These are all examples of points where the racial caste system has shown some level of vulnerability or instability, and where another world has been possible or has at least seemed possible. Finally, fourth, the cross-racial alliance, third, apologies, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Cross-racial alliances have been responsible for the instability of the racial caste system. So the periods when the racial caste system has been most unstable involve white, especially poor and working class white folks, joining together with black people against white wealthy capital owning interests in the US. And typically those movements have been spurred by black leadership and by black demands for justice, for enfranchisement, recognition of personhood, distribution of rights and resources to black folks, and have managed at their most disruptive, at their most powerful, to get an interracial coalition together. Black leadership has been successful in those most disruptive moments in bringing poor and working class white people especially to its side. So those disruptions of the racial caste system tend to occur when there is significant momentum developed by a cross-racial alliance, although generally instigated by a black leadership. Finally, fourth, racial bribes and racial resentment tend to be what tear apart cross-racial alliances. So after periods of disruption, as moments of progress and possibility emerge and seem possible, new racial caste systems tend to be cemented by racial bribes given by white capital-owning elites to poor and working class whites to get them to abandon their black allies. And these bribes play upon anti-black prejudice and give working class whites what W.E.B. Du Bois called a psychological wage, or what David Roediger would call the wages of whiteness. So they give white people a sense, working class and poor white people, a sense of status by allowing them to oppose themselves to black people marked as other, over whom they are granted measures of legal, economic, and political control. And they use often, part of those racial bribes is often the license to engage in racial terrorism or anti-black violence. So those four things: one, the continuous white over black color line; two, the instability of the racial caste system; three, the role of cross-racial alliances in disrupting racial caste; and four, the role of racial bribes and racial resentment in tearing apart cross-racial alliances. Those are structural features that help to explain both how it can be the case that both the racial caste system in the US has some enduring features that maintain over time, and how that racial caste system has been unstable and volatile and prone to moments of disruption. And that structure of racial caste plays a really big role, as we'll see, in explaining the criminal legal system, both in its current formation, why it looks the way that it does, and in the effects of that criminal legal system, why it is the case that mass incarceration tends to be brown and black mass incarceration rather than sort of an proportionally distributed mass incarceration of people across American society, why black and brown people are targeted by the system of policing and imprisonment in the US. So this lecture hopefully will help you to understand that sort of organizing logic of racism that continues to drive the criminal legal system in the US today, and to explain its particular form and set of motivations. Okay, so in the lecture itself, I'm going to try and break this lecture into two major parts. In the first part, we're basically going to talk about the period from right before 1676 in the colonial Americas, right before Bacon's Rebellion, through chattel slavery and the Civil War, into the post-Civil War period, the Reconstruction and the Redemption, and through the emergence of Jim Crow. That's going to be part one. That's obviously a lot of ground to cover. It's essentially going to go up between 1676-ish and 1915. So obviously, in this first part of the lecture, there's going to be some things that are left out, some things that are maybe emphasized more than some historians would emphasize them, some things that are emphasized less than some historians would emphasize them. But the goal, again, is just to give you sort of a background sense of what some of that history looks like. And then in part two, we're going to talk about basically everything from the Great Migration of Black folks into northern industrial cities, which starts roughly 1915, 1916, through the death of Jim Crow, the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement, and then we're going to discuss the birth of mass incarceration, the Southern strategies used by the Republican Party, and the emergence of the war on drugs. And we're going to go basically up through the year 2000. Part of the reason I'm stopping at the year 2000 is simply because it's really for three reasons. One, you're probably going to read a lot of evidence that picks up at or describes the period between 2000 and 2020. It's very likely you'll encounter that evidence. Two, it's exactly the sort of history that you're going to discuss in lab, so you'll get that history and that texture in other places, and it'll show up in the debates that you're going to have. And then third, that period from 2000 to 2020 comes closer to the period that that shapes your lived experience. That you all, many of you all have been alive at least from 2005, 2006 onwards. So you're aware of at least some of that history. You've heard it talked about, you've heard it discussed on the news, etc. So I'm trying to cover the periods that are the least likely to be discussed in lab, relevant to your everyday lived experience, or something that you come across in your research as you're cutting an affirmative or negative position, to give you that texture that you won't get somewhere else. Okay, so in pre-1676 in the colonial Americas, Michelle Alexander argues that there's sort of a system of exploitation in the colonial Americas that is not quite so obviously a white over black system of exploitation. It's certainly true that there are black slaves in the Americas, but there are also white indentured servants, there are black indentured servants, there are also enslaved indigenous folks. And the system of chattel slavery as we know it in the United States of America has not, and even in the colonial Americas, has not been quite so formalized as it would come to be. So slavery exists, but its structures vary depending upon the particular colony that you're talking about. And it's not quite so clearly an institution that is solely enslaving black folks. It looks somewhat more like previous variants of slavery that existed in places like ancient Greece and in Europe, in which slavery was not the hereditary ownership of people forever and the ownership of their descendants, but was a sort of more complex system of unpaid indentured servitude. So the system of slavery, that's not to say there was no chattel slavery. It's a very complex period because, obviously there wasn't a constitution or a formalized governmental structure controlling and tying all the colonies together at that point in time prior to 1676. So there's not like a you know, a holistic truth that exists for all of these different areas. But basically, Michelle Alexander makes the point that the common denominator is that Black, white, and indigenous folks do work together on plantations that are controlled by white European planter elites. And those elites seek to exploit all of those people economically to enrich themselves and to ensure that the profits of their agricultural economy are returned to the white aristocratic plantation elite. So it's a system of primarily of economic exploitation that is at this point not so clearly divided by race. However, in 1676, Bacon's rebellion breaks out in Virginia. And this rebellion essentially starts because Nathaniel Bacon was angry that he couldn't get militia support and support from the local Virginia military to steal indigenous lands and to build together a coalition of farmers to go and take additional land and settle a frontier. In response, due to a whole series of concerns with the Virginia governor, Berkeley, a unified movement of Black and white indentured servants united against the rich white plantation elite and stirred up quite a rebellion in the Virginia territory. And the rebellion frightened the planter elite, and many of the rebels were hanged. Now, it's notable that in the crackdown against the rebellion, the Virginia government and the local planter elite particularly chose to crack down against the Black rebels who participated in the rebellion differently from the white rebels. So already there are obvious seeds of a strategy of dividing the white indentured servants from the Black indentured servants and Black slaves, and even from the indigenous slaves in the area. So the intention is explicitly to treat those two groups differently in the response and in the doling out of the punishment to Bacon's rebellion. And after Bacon's rebellion, there's a real sort of reckoning that happens among the plantation elite that these groups of workers need to be treated separately and divided against one another. Otherwise, there's simply too many of them for the relatively small number of plantation elite to control. There are just too many workers for them to control if they decide to unify and rise up together. So chattel slavery starts to emerge. In 1705, for example, the Virginia slave codes are passed. There's a number of other slave codes that are passed between 1676 and 1705, but the Virginia slave codes are particularly notable. And all of these various slave codes tends to function as with a series of racial bribes attached to them that give poor and working class whites explicit rights that are not given to, and in fact stripped of, the Black indentured servants in the area. And those Black indentured servants are progressively placed under a more and more aggressive system of chattel slavery that involves direct ownership and control, complete submission to the master on the plantation, and it creates a system of legal ownership in which those slaves can be transacted across plantations by plantation owners, and in which the descendants of slaves are also considered property by legal and political institutions in the American colonies. So already you can see, first of all, that there's a very stark division being created between white indentured servants, many of whom are bondspeople who are very poorly paid or essentially unpaid, and chattel slaves who are completely robbed of any sense of humanity. The white indentured servant, while not paid, does not have their liberty exploited, nor they do not experience the same complete abandonment of rights that the Black chattel slaves do. So there's a real difference between these groups. One of the racial bribes that's given to poor and working class whites are slave patrols, which allows those groups to monitor and oversee slaves and creates a set of white expectations about Black behavior, mobility, and occupation of space. Allows poor and working class whites to become the people that get to decide in what places it's okay for Black folks to walk around, when it's okay for them, or if it's okay for them to drink or eat, what it's okay for them to eat. So already in the 1700s, there is a sort of proto-police force being formed that involves poor white folks patrolling and monitoring space according to codes of racial expectation and racial ideology. And historian Jeff Forrett in an article, basically calls this the sort of precursor to the contemporary phenomenon of white people calling the cops on black people for being in a park. It's sort of the Amy Cooper phenomenon of calling the police on black bird watchers or black folks having a picnic or whatever. So there's already this very strict sense of poor and working class whites getting the racial bribe of getting to decide how space is allocated and controlled ideologically. And as the American Revolution picks up, there's a whole ideology of pseudoscientific racism that's emerging at the same time that liberalism is emerging in Europe and in the Americas, in the French and American revolutions, and in some of the liberal bourgeois salons where revolutionary thought is beginning to develop. And this body of thought in Europe and the Americas manages the contradictions between purportedly universal political rights and colonial regimes of violence and exploitation / the plantation regime of chattel slavery. So at the same time that liberalism is proclaiming, or proto-liberalism is proclaiming, that every person should have the right to participate in the polity, to vote, to have their voice heard, to be recognized and respected as an individual with intrinsic worth. These same systems of thought, put together by people like John Locke and David Hume, also are often backgrounded with pseudoscientific theories that suggest that black people are inferior or civilizationally backward in some way, and that they cannot be trusted with political control. And even as abolitionist theories develop alongside these, the proto-development of European liberalism, many of the American and European abolitionists also have these pseudoscientific theories of racism. They believe that slavery is a bad institution, but at the same time, they don't believe in extending political enfranchisement or control of political institutions to black folks. Because they believe them to be inferior. And that's the case with, for example, John Adams and then Benjamin Franklin. Danielle Allen talks about this, a political philosopher from Harvard talks about this in her recent book about the Declaration of Independence, that there's an abolitionist streak behind the Declaration of Independence, but at the same time, many of those abolitionists also held some really monstrously racist views about black intellectual capacity and social capacity. So there's this whole theory of pseudoscientific racism developing at that time, and the purposes of that theory is, even when it's abolitionist, to manage the contradiction between white political control and control over property and the purportedly universal system of liberal rights. Now, that's not to say, by the way, one caveat to that is that there are some radical abolitionists, including white radical abolitionists, who do believe in the importance of giving black folks enfranchisement, even in the early revolution. While that's not an especially widespread view, those people do exist. And they become increasingly sort of forceful as we moved into the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. So during the period of chattel slavery, there's a brutal system of plantation ownership and control that involves complete submission of slaves to slave masters. There are frequent slave revolts. Black people do not accept, nor do they like this system, contrary to what reunion films and other ideological texts throughout American history have presented. They frequently resisted and were severely punished for their resistance, but they resisted nonetheless. And there were a number of events, including the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion, that really frightened white plantation owners and that ratcheted up the system of brutal exploitation and control. And this system led to the South becoming a real agricultural powerhouse in the early years of the Americas, in which, because of this system of exploitation and dehumanization, it became possible for plantations to produce enormous profit and to extract enormous amounts of surplus value from slaves who had been entirely dehumanized. So this is a real profit engine for Southern plantation owners, both because they get capital ownership of the slaves who are part of their plantation, who they can sell to other plantation owners, and because their plantations themselves tend to be profitable. But it's important to note that this was not a system that was in any way consensual, and there were frequent slave rebellions that occurred throughout the system of chattel slavery, again, contrary to the ideological texts that have existed throughout American history that have suggested that slavery was really more consensual, or that slave masters in some way treated their slaves relatively well. That really is not true and was not widespread. And in part, the Civil War occurs because the engine of economic power begins to turn in the Americas as Northern industrialists gain increasing power over the American economy. Industrialization means that per worker, the North has become much more efficient in producing goods, textiles, coal, iron, through industrialized manufacturing techniques taken from Britain and other countries, are produced very rapidly in the North. Steam power and coal power coming from the use of coal and steam allow the North to power these enormous factories that are quite productive. And as a result, both because of industrialization and because of abolitionist ideology, which spreads in part because of the North's growing economic power, Northerners become increasingly frustrated with the political power that the South holds. And the South holds such extensive political power, holds a lot of sway in the early Americas, because slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of political representation. So on the one hand, ideologically, abolitionists are frustrated with what they see as an immoral system of enslavement. And on the other hand, for self-interested political reasons, they're also frustrated because while Southerners treat slaves as not being human, which they consider to be, Northerners consider to be immoral in many cases, at the same time, the Southerners, for the purposes of political representation, get to count those slaves as 3/5 of a human being, so that they can enhance their political power in Congress. So there's real growing Northern outrage, both from a perspective of self-interest and political and economic frustration, and from a perspective of moral outrage that the system of exploitation, which has been outlawed in Britain and France by this time, is still a legal and morally acceptable practice in the South. Now, again, I don't want to sugarcoat the abolitionists. Many of these abolitionists hold monstrously racist views about Black political participation and Black intellectual and social capacity, while at the same time believing that slavery is a morally unjust institution. There are many of them who do not hold those views. Many of them also believe in Black political enfranchisement and had a more progressive perspective on Black folks, including notably John Brown. But there are also many abolitionists who support abolition for reasons that are more self-interested, or for reasons that are consistent with a belief in Black people as racially inferior, that are still really monstrously racist. So, so during this time period, there's increasing political and economic frustration, and there's a series of back and forth political stalemates that occur as a result of conflict over whether or not new states admitted to the Union should be free states or slave states. And that sort of bubbles to a head with the introduction of Missouri and the Missouri Compromise, introduction of Missouri as a slave state into the Union, and then Bleeding Kansas, which was a frontier battle between various pro and anti-slavery groups in Kansas, the Kansas Territory, to determine whether or not the state of Kansas would be entered as a free state or a slave state into the Union. And those fights involved various paramilitary groups killing off each other in order to try and enhance the voting power of their particular block. So it was vicious, very violent, and a sort of set of precipitating events that led to the South seceding from the Union over fears that slavery would not survive the sort of growing power, political power of the North and economic power of the North. So during the Civil War, I'm not going to go too much into the detail about the Civil War, but during the Civil War, one of the important turning points in the war comes when between sort of 1862 and 1863, Black soldiers are allowed and begin to enlist in numbers in the Union Army. W.E.B. Du Bois isolates that as one of the turning points in the Civil War. And that gave the North significantly greater numbers. It helped to boost a military that had been decimated by some really horrific battles early in the war. So as a result, Black soldiers, often fighting in segregated units, often treated very poorly, even by their Union comrades, do play a very important role in the Civil War. And that does, and this is a kind of enduring theme that we're going to talk about in several different points, that experience, even though it's still segregated, even though many of the Union soldiers are also racist, that experience of having Black soldiers play an important role in the Civil War does create, on the part of many Union loyalists, a sense of loyalty and solidarity with Black folks after the war that extends and helps to propel arguments for Black political enfranchisement during the Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, Southern economies are really devastated. There's been enormous destruction of land and life throughout the South. 4 million enslaved people have been liberated from slavery, decimating the workforce of the plantations of slave masters, and creating profound economic and social crisis in its wake, as any war is prone to do, especially such a bloody one. That's something that, that moment of economic and political crisis creates a sense that among Southern plantation elites, that they need to do something to try and reestablish control. After Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and Andrew Johnson, while a Republican, is not nearly as committed to the radical Republican cause or the Reconstruction. As a result, in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's assassination in 1866, a variety of different Southern states pass what are called the Black Codes. I should back up for a moment. The 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865 after the end of the Civil War, and that amendment outlaws slavery, but includes what comes to be a loophole allowing slavery as a punishment for crime, leading to the emergence, in part because of the economic chaos that Southern plantation elite has been thrown into, of a new penal system created to revive the South's economy after the collapse caused by the abolition of slavery. So after the 13th Amendment is ratified, there's still that loophole that allows people to be enslaved or to have their labor be unpaid as a punishment for crime. And Southern plantation elites seize upon that. So while Johnson is president, again, somebody who's really not committed to the project of radical Reconstruction or radical republicanism, the seeds of Jim Crow are planted in many Southern states with Southern plantation elite, who still maintain a lot of political power in those states, passing a series of laws called the Black Codes. Essentially, these are laws criminalizing things like vagrancy in employment. They required, in many cases, Black people to show that they were employed each year, to present some document certifying their employment. And these Black Codes essentially led to a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for Black folks in the South, in which either they were forced, in order to comply with these laws, to participate in sharecropping, in which they'd enlist to work the fields for this very same Southern plantation elite who had previously been slave masters. And when they did enlist to work as sharecroppers, which was hardly voluntary given the Black Codes, as we'll talk about in just a second, they were often charged things like room and board, for food, for clothing, for use of equipment, etc., at ridiculous prices that made it completely impossible for them to ever pay off their debts. And it functionally meant that they were enslaved, that they were stuck working those plantations for the rest of their lives. So for many Black freed persons in the South, especially in this early period, the end of the Civil War and the advent of sharecropping had hardly changed their political, social, and economic position in the U.S. Yes, they're not technically chattel slaves, but they still are forced to work on plantations without being paid under a brutal system of exploitation. And you know, that in some ways, that system of exploitation, I went to the, you know, the National African American History Museum in DC a couple years ago, and there's a number of different exhibits suggesting that that system was actually worse than chattel slavery had been for many people, because since the plantation elite did not technically own and didn't have a capital interest in the people who were working their fields, they were perfectly willing to work them to death. So that system was especially brutal and unjust and exploitative in a way that even the really unimaginable conditions of chattel slavery perhaps were not, according to at least some historians and some thinkers. So there's, on the one hand, many black codes force many black folks into sharecropping. On the other hand, there's a whole system, and this really connects to the topic, of convict leasing that emerges. So if you're a black person in the South and you don't decide to enlist, you know, to be employed on a plantation, or do one of a handful of other things that are available as employment avenues for black folks in the mid 1860s, then you'll be arrested for vagrancy and you'll be put into the convict leasing system, which is arguably even more brutally unjust and exploitative than sharecropping. Convict leasing allows for various police forces and paramilitary groups to go around and arrest black folks, take them to prisons, and then create huge labor forces who can only pay off the debts that are the penalties for vagrancy, which they can't afford. They're extremely high debts. Who can only pay off those debts using manual labor. So they create these huge labor forces that do things like coal mining, work in lumber camps. Some of them work on fields. And those labor camps functionally become even more grossly exploitative versions of sharecropping, in which it's impossible to pay off the debt. The prison, much like the plantation, charges the folks working at it for food, room and board, to lease equipment, etc., at prices that are far too high. The debts include late fees that they can never pay off. So some of those people are functionally convicted of vagrancy laws and sentenced to life terms performing manual labor. And many of those people do not survive long in the convict leasing system because, again, unlike even the unimaginably violent system of chattel slavery, in this system, they're so disposable that in many ways the system is even more unconscionable and exploitative. So the convict leasing system and sharecropping sort of form, again, this damned if you do, damned if you don't system that means that the 13th Amendment, while outlawing slavery, has not really done away with the position of black people as being dehumanized. And the seeds of Jim Crow are already planted in this convict leasing system. You can already start to see how policing and control are going to work. And it really is important to note that these, you know, are scarcely in any sense systems of law. They are almost completely naked attempts to re-enslave black folks. In 1860, for example, historian Jeff Forrett says that 2/3 of Louisiana prisoners were white. There's very little reason to imprison black folks for long periods of time during a regime of chattel slavery, because instead you could enslave them, which is, you know, obviously awful, but there's no economic motivation in that situation for imprisonment or incarceration over a long period of time. However, in 1868, after the 13th Amendment, 2/3 of those incarcerated are black. So it's pretty obvious that the prison system in those southern states like Louisiana simply becomes the new system of chattel slavery. And that's part of a widespread flip in the racialization of incarceration post-Civil War, in which black folks become the target of the system of incarceration. In addition, in the convict leasing system, 9/10 of those, according to Kathy Ford and Brian Bowman, are black. So there are hardly any people, relatively speaking, given the proportionality of the population in southern states, who are in the convict leasing system or who are in prisons who are who are white at this time. Those systems are very obviously being used as mechanisms for re-enslaving and targeting black folks. However, and this is where, so you might be thinking, okay, well, you said the Civil War, you know, plays an important role in disrupting the racial caste system in the US. However, and that's true. After 1867, the radical Republicans really take control of the political system in the US. They start to override vetoes of Johnson's. They pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866 over Johnson's veto. And essentially, this piece of legislation grants Black folks citizenship and attempts to act as a congressional overrule of the 1857 Supreme Court system, Dred Scott, which ruled that Black folks, essentially because of their lack of humanity, were not citizens of the United States. So the radical Republicans do attempt to undertake a program of Black enfranchisement, despite Andrew Johnson's reticence to do that. And as a result of their anger at Johnson and a series of other scandals associated with his administration, he is impeached, and he survives conviction of impeachment only by a single vote in the Senate. And there's considerable historical evidence to suggest that he managed to avoid conviction for impeachment, mostly because of some pretty obvious corruption and some backroom dealing that allowed him to survive. So Johnson is really hated by the Congress at this time, and they consistently work to overrule him. So the radical Reconstruction, this period in which the radical Republicans take control of Reconstruction, essentially takes place from 1867 to 1877. Although the Reconstruction is typically all of the 12 years post-Civil War, this is the period in which the most radical reforms are undertaken. It includes the passage of the 14th Amendment, which is adopted in 1868, and which constitutionalized the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which some Congress people and senators were concerned was unconstitutional, and ensured the overrule by constitutional amendment of the Dred Scott decision. This clause importantly includes the Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees and also guarantees birthright citizenship to all of those born in the United States. So the 14th Amendment, unlike the 13th Amendment, which, while progressive, has this major loophole that is just brutally exploited by Southern plantation owners, the 14th Amendment includes some language that is really sort of unambiguously progressive. Whether or not it's enforced that way at various points in time is another matter, but the 14th Amendment is sort of more unambiguously progressive. And Southern states, radical Republicans, required that Southern states ratify the amendment in order for their Congress people to be seated in Congress as a condition of their enfranchisement in political institutions. So radical Republicans undertook a pretty radical agenda to ensure Black political enfranchisement with the 14th Amendment. And the Equal Protection Clause is arguably one of, if not the most important avenues for progressive legal action in the Supreme Court. It's the basis for the Brown v. Board ruling. It's the basis for Roe v. Wade. And it's also the basis for Obergefell v. Hodges. So many of the most progressive Supreme Court decisions that follow are a direct byproduct of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. And many of the difficulties that Southerners have in repressing Black political expression are a byproduct of the birthright citizenship guarantee granted by the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, also prohibits abridging the right to vote on the basis of race, explicitly intending to protect the power of Black citizens to vote in the election. And that was the understanding of President Grant when he supported the adoption of the 15th Amendment, that the 15th Amendment would ensure the enfranchisement of Black folks. You know, Grant is a complex historical figure. Historians are very divided on the extent to which Grant was progressive. And, you know, I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture of Grant, but as a president, Grant is certainly far more concerned with Black political enfranchisement than Andrew Johnson. And he does play a major role in the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, the Reconstruction process also includes a series of other progressive reforms which create real social, political, and economic possibility for African Americans that happen in the aftermath of 1867 and 1868, when the radical Republicans really take control of the process, and after Grant is elected president. That includes Black access to public and political institutions, high levels of schooling, libraries, the Freedmen's Bureau, which provides some resources and opportunities for Black folks in the South. So there's a number of different institutions that are created after 1867 and 1868 that really seek to bring opportunity and political and social enfranchisement to Black folks. At the same time, however, the Reconstruction does suffer from corruption on the part of a number of the cabinet officials in the Grant administration, and is dogged by a lack of land reform. The 40 acres and a mule are never given to Black folks who served in the Union Army. The Southern plantations are never broken up, despite calls by many radical Republicans to do so. And as a result, Black folks remain in a position of economic subordination in the South, and they have very few avenues for work and opportunity available to them, despite the availability of schooling and libraries and the possibility of them voting and being elected to congressional positions. And in part, they really suffer from a lack of land reform because in the aftermath of chattel slavery, many African Americans have worked their entire lives on farms. So they are especially competent, capable, interested in owning their own farms and working them. They're very capable of doing so. But the problem is that they don't have any land. And in order to make a profit as a farmer, in order to really experience economic freedom as a farmer, you have to have some level of ownership and control over the land and the capital, or else it's impossible for that profit to return to you. The rental costs and the capital costs of working on a farm that you do not own are simply too high for you to make the money to have economic freedom, particularly in the South in the late 1860s. So as a result, the failure of land reform really leaves Black folks in a position of economic subordination, despite the newfound ability to vote in elections. Also during this time and throughout the adoption of the 15th Amendment, the Ku Klux Klan becomes a major force of racial terrorism in the South and seeks a campaign of redemption in which Southern white supremacists, including plantation owners, but many former Confederate soldiers, enabled by, in some cases, by national government accommodation, notably by the Democratic Party and by Southern political elites, but also some Northern political elites as well, are using a campaign of racial terrorism to threaten Black people who attempt to vote, who stand for office, who are working as teachers, who are taking positions of civic and social leadership in cities throughout the South, and really using violence and terrorism to intimidate those Black folks, attempting to enforce a segregated racial caste system and to ensure that their social and political power is not disrupted by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Interestingly, for the topic, in response to the Klan, and really for years, until roughly 1874, the federal government maintained a military presence in the South, which during the Johnson administration is run by General Grant, and then later is run by General Sherman, which is interested in maintaining and enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the South. So interestingly, for the topic, in 1870, Grant creates the Justice Department. So this is the origin of the Department of Justice, is to prosecute the KKK for refusing to comply with federal law. And the Grant administration is mostly effective. There's a lot of complex history behind this, but it's mostly effective in combating the Klan's power until roughly 1874, when Democrats retake the House and the Grant administration, beset by a variety of corruption scandals, has difficulty maintaining support for Reconstruction. So from 1870 to 1874, the Justice Department is working with the federal military to try to prosecute members of the Klan to ensure that Black folks can vote and can participate in elections. And as a result of Reconstruction, Grant wins both his first and second terms of office. And in both of those elections, the Black electorate plays a major role in ensuring that Grant is elected president and maintains his presidency, despite a variety of different scandals and despite being enormously unpopular with white Southerners and with some Northerners as well. But by 1874 and really on through 1877, the Reconstruction starts to fall apart. And the laws on the books are enforced less strongly, and sharecropping and convict leasing become more directly exploited by Southerners to ensure the permanent subordination of Black folks again in the South as second-class citizens. Northerners start to lose interest. Democrats win several elections, both in the House and eventually several presidential elections, and they start to regain political power, ensuring that federal troops leave the South and eventually that the Reconstruction is eventually abandoned, and that the redemption in many ways wins and carries the day. And in those cases where there is still radical Republican or even Republican control of legislatures, or where the Democrats' power is more muted, states like North Carolina, the Ku Klux Klan operates as a force for paramilitary terrorism, ensuring the racial caste system is maintained. So during this period of time, from roughly 1874 through the 1880s and 1890s, there's this real reassertion of the Southern plantation elite using the convict leasing system and sharecropping as tools to ensure the dehumanization and subordination and exploitation of Black folks in the South. Now, during this time period, Michelle Alexander argues there is essentially, in the post-Reconstruction period, three Southern philosophies of race relations. There is a liberal philosophy of race relations that emphasized racial discrimination, contradicted the universality of personhood, which those folks understood as being enshrined in the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, and especially in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And it also contradicted the universality of political participation. This liberal discourse of race relations gained relatively little momentum in the South with either Blacks or white folks. Many Black folks were very skeptical of the Constitution. They were skeptical of the idea that white folks were going to enforce these laws. They had experienced, an almost unchanging system of white racial terrorism and exploitation, so they weren't buying it. White folks, similarly, were not really buying the system. The wealthy plantation elite and the educated classes were largely racial conservatives, which we'll get to in just a second. And the poorer white folks were either racial radicals or they were extreme racial conservatives. So the liberal discourse doesn't really have a constituency in the South. The second discourse of race relations is a conservative discourse of race relations. It's very popular among the white plantation elite and among a lot of the white poor and working classes. And at this time, there isn't really a white middle class to speak of because of the structure of the Southern agrarian economy. So the Reconstruction, the conservative philosophy of race relations, claims that the Reconstruction pushed Black people into positions they weren't yet ready to fill. And it was a discourse that played upon the pseudoscientific theories of race that had been very popular and had been generated in the late 1700s, and it served as a background for some of the philosophy of liberalism, but took on a more virulent, conservative, and aggressively bigoted sense. So this pseudo-conservative philosophy of race relations is backed up by a class of pseudoscientific experts and technocrats who couch themselves as providing irrefutable objective evidence of Black intellectual and cultural inferiority. And obviously we know now that these theories, really in no sense of the word can be called science. There's nothing about them that's scientific. They're really just nonsense invented as an ideological tool to ensure a dominant white over Black racial caste system is maintained. Finally, the last Southern philosophy of race relations, and the one that's arguably the most interesting, is the radical philosophy of race relations. It involved a populist critique of wealthy white owners that called for poor white and Black folks to unite and included moves towards racial integration. It was especially powerful among Black folks, but it also gains traction among many poor white agricultural workers. And in some ways, it's a callback to some of the same concepts and concerns for white plantation owners that animated Bacon's rebellion, that white agrarian workers and black sharecroppers and people placed in the convict leasing system working oftentimes side by side in the fields in the aftermath of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would join together and overthrow the power of the relatively, the numerically small power of the white plantation elite, would usurp them through a cross-racial movement. And in some places, that alliance of white and black agrarian workers did have real electoral success in the 1880s and 1890s, oftentimes joining together with the remaining radical Republicans in state and city municipal political chambers. So that included, especially in North Carolina, there were some successful populist alliances that Michelle Alexander talks about that involved white and black agrarian workers working together and managing to maintain some of the momentum of Reconstruction. However, even in the places, I want to emphasize, first of all, that this radical philosophy of race relations was not, the same level didn't have the same level of political inertia and political power that the Reconstruction did. It was never as widespread as that. There are many southern states where this populist alliance didn't really exist or wasn't successful. And even when it was successful, it really did face, in many cases, the profound bigotry of many of the white folks that were participating in this cross-racial alliance. However, the electoral success in places like North Carolina of black-white radical populist movements led racial conservatives and the white plantation elite to wage all-out campaigns of white supremacy, including and especially North Carolina, where they used paramilitary organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to subvert federal and state laws and to create a regime of racial terrorism that prevented black people from exercising their legally guaranteed rights. And that at the same time, as it used this campaign of racial terrorism, in elections used and played upon racial resentments, offering a series of racial bribes. So there's this concept coming back again to white folks that created a new white psychological investment in racism in places like North Carolina. And they enshrined across the South a raft of laws institutionalizing segregation passed throughout the late 1890s and through the early 1900s. And those laws included things like mandating segregation of education, access to public institutions, access to public infrastructure, including things, most famously like water fountains and pools, instituting poll tax and grandfather clauses that made it impossible for black folks to vote despite the 15th Amendment. So really the result of these radical populist movements, while they do gain some momentum in some places, is a combination of backlash, Redeemer backlash, in which states where those populist movements did not even occur, like Alabama, passed segregation laws as a response to and out of fear of those populist movements spreading to those states, and in which the states that did successfully have radical populist movements, like North Carolina, see the emergence of paramilitary terrorist organizations like the KKK that attempt to subvert the elected political order to ensure that black folks cannot exercise their rights and cannot build independent social, political, and economic power. One of the important kind of ideological moments in all of this, I've talked a little bit about Redeemerism and the reunion ideology that emerged in the post-Reconstruction period among both racist Northerners and the Southern plantation elites. One of the really important ideological moments for Redeemerism and reunion discourse is the film Birth of a Nation, which was released in 1915. It was an enormously influential film that in gross adjusted terms made between $50 and $100 million, which is an unprecedented amount of money at the time. It had an enormous budget. It was a very technically, while it's a very ideologically crude and disgusting film, from a technical perspective, it's a very sophisticated movie that they spent a lot of money producing. It was screened by Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States at the time. I've seen the film. I took a class called History of African American Images in Film, where we watched the movie and talked about some of the cultural context around it. And the movie set off a whole series of reunion perspectives on the Civil War. So the film presents Black folks as animalistic. It shows images of white women threatened by rape by Black men. And it led to, and it presents the KKK as a sort of heroic force, preserving the sexual purity of white women and the social and moral order of segregation and white supremacy. The film led to the rebirth of the KKK. The idea of burning crosses on lawns was actually not a practice of the KKK, at least according to some of the commentators in the movie 13th. Instead, it was actually taken, it was an idea invented by D.W. Griffith, the producer and writer of the film, who thought it looked more dramatic on camera. And it was taken up by the KKK after the film. So that's how enormously influential this film was. And like I said, it set off a whole series of reunion Civil War films that presented this ideological perspective that the Civil War had been a sort of misunderstanding between Northern and Southern white brothers who had sort of fought brother against brother during the conflict and had been divided by the sort of usurping attempts by Black folks to become enfranchised. So in some ways, 1910, 1915, even in the North, becomes a period where the sort of radical ideology and radical philosophy of race relations that had taken hold during the Reconstruction among a lot of Northerners and even some Southerners, that philosophy starts to give way to the influence of this reunion philosophy. Pseudoscientific theories of racism gain enormous power and force in both the North and the South. These reunion films depict the Civil War as sort of the Confederacy as a lost cause and the Civil War as a misunderstanding. And as a result, even in the North, sort of the most progressive elements of racial philosophy are in many ways kind of rolled back. And some of those ideas start to lose the power and influence that they had in the Reconstruction period. And that's in part because the violence of the Civil War starts to fade. Those who served in the Union Army start to pass away and die off, and you get a new generation, especially with the wave of immigration from Europe, of people who did not participate in the Civil War, do not have the memory of a bitterly contested conflict against the slave-holding South, and they're intransigents against the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the federal government. So they don't have as much of a stake in that fight. They don't have that memory. It loses hold. During this time period, it's also really important to note that in part because of Birth of a Nation, but in part this influences Birth of the Nation, the film itself, there are a whole series of post-Reconstruction lynchings. Many of these are carried out by the KKK, but many of them are not. Many of them are carried out by ordinary white folks who in some cases are using lynching as a tool of amusement and are using anti-Black violence as a form of civic and social solidarity and bonding. And in other cases are part and parcel of this discourse of Black sexual violence that presents Black men as animalistic and a threat to the purity of white women. They constantly present images and discourses of that Black men are going to rape white women, which is depicted in Birth of the Nation. And those really, virulent myths about sexuality lead to this awful campaign of racial terrorism and lynching, which, in conjunction with the convict leasing and sharecropping systems, as well as the KKK operating as a paramilitary organization, functions as sort of a proto form of policing through terrorism, using the fear produced by lynching as a form of policing in order to maintain social control, in order to maintain the social order of a particular white over Black racial caste system. So in some ways, lynching can be understood, and the KKK can be understood as sort of proto forms of policing, not policing in the sense of enforcing the law per se, because in many cases they're subverting the law that's on the books, but as ways of enforcing a sort of social or perverse moral law of white supremacy. So they are sort of proto forms of policing, and they come to shape the way that the legal system, those lynching, the KKK, and convict leasing and sharecropping, come to shape the way that Jim Crow is implemented, understood, and the motivations for those systems. They create this entwined system of fear, racial terrorism, and ideology that says that those forms of violence are just because they are guaranteed by the sort of higher perverse moral law of white supremacy. So in that sense, they come to influence the way that the management of space and populations and the sense of justice that exists in the South, and in some cases the North as well, emerges. So we're going to end this part here with in roughly the period of 1915 or so, in which the Great Migration of Black folks to the North begins. We'll pick up on that in part 2. But just to recap really briefly, I hope you've seen throughout this lecture that there are these various sort of structural features that continue to recur within the racial caste system. It tends to be the case that the racial caste system both involves a sort of perverse social and moral law in which white folks are placed over Black folks as you know, the pillars of civilization and humanity, and Black folks are dehumanized and not recognized politically as persons. And it also tends to be the case that Black dehumanization is a tool or an engine for economic growth, is a mechanism for economic exploitation. And those two things, dehumanization and economic exploitation of Black folks, work in tandem to maintain this racial caste system. It's not, especially in the period after Bacon's Rebellion, it's not primarily economic or primarily cultural / social. It's both of those things at the same time. The economic exploitation of Black folks is in some part the motivation for the white planter elite and for slaveholders to hold fast to the view that Black people are not human because they want to make money. They can accumulate property, status, and wealth from the dehumanization of Black folks. And at the same time, the social and cultural dehumanization of Black folks divides and creates a racial bribe for white indentured servants and poor and working class white folks to continue participating in a political economic system that is really not advantageous to them, that doesn't result in them receiving significant economic rewards, significant social status. Instead, they gain social status simply by virtue of their ability. They gain what, again, Du Bois called a psychological wage, simply by virtue of their ability, their special racial bribe to get to dehumanize Black folks. So those two systems, again, work hand in hand. The system of social, cultural, and moral dehumanization of Black folks, the lack of recognition of their personhood, and the political and economic exploitation of Black people and Black labor by whatever form the racial caste system is taking. So that's one key takeaway. The other key takeaway I want to make sure you get is that that throughout this process, the role that there are moments of instability, including within the law itself, where in some cases, the law is a tool for the expression of pseudoscientific racism, a tool for compromises that maintain the Southern plantation elite's power, including the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Missouri Compromise. And in other cases is a mechanism for allowing for progress for Black folks, that allows for their enfranchisement, that allows for them to gain greater levels of social, political, and civic standing in their communities, that ensures their protection. In some cases, the law operates as a vehicle for the exercise and use of military force and policing power, including the creation of the Justice Department in 1870. So in some cases, the law is an expression, and including the Black codes and Jim Crow as well, of virulent racism, of white supremacy, of that racial caste system. And in other cases, the law is a tool backed by military power and by a cross-racial coalition of white and Black folks that fights that racial caste system, that generates instability within it, and that creates disorder. Importantly, however, in almost all of the moments that we're going to talk about in which the law functions as a tool for Black progress and it functions as a mechanism for disrupting the prevailing racial caste system, that occurs because there is, not because the law itself is doing the driving, is driving the bus, but instead because there is a grassroots cross-racial coalitional movement led by white folk, or led by Black folks, but including some participation from white folks, that it's because that movement exists that the law is interpreted and enforced in a fashion that is more progressive. Without that movement, the law wouldn't be enforced that way, and it tends to be the case that campaigns of racial terrorism and repression instead win out, and the law is enforced in a way that upholds white supremacy. So the moments of disruption are possible, but those moments of disruption only come about as a result of Black folks creating movements and getting some level of white support to generate instability within the existing racial caste system, creating political, social, and economic power that can ensure that the law is enforced in a way that does not uphold, but instead disrupts the prevailing racial caste system. Okay, so we'll end there for part one, and we'll pick up part two next.